Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you, both those few whom we can welcome in person to the room, and the number of you who are also joining us online for this annual Las Casas lecture. As you may know, the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice takes its inspiration from the 16th century Dominican friar Bartolome de Las Casas, who championed the rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The Institute seeks to bring the Catholic intellectual tradition to bear on pressing issues of social justice. And particularly for those of you who are joining us online, do please use the chat box online in order to put in questions so that you can be a full part of the discussion which will follow this evening's talk. Well, it's a particular pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker this evening, Baroness O'Loan. Baroness O'Loan graduated in law from King's College London in 1973 and became a law lecturer in Northern Ireland. She held the Jean Monnet Chair in European Law at the University of Ulster from 1992 until her appointment in 1999 as police ombudsman, just a fortnight, I think, before the Good Friday Agreement of that year. Herself the survivor of a bombing and someone for whom political violence has struck tragically in her own family, she was asked in 2001 to investigate police handling of the 1998 Omagh bombing, issuing a report highly critical of what the Royal Ulster Constabulary knew but did not do in the period before the bombing. And it's a measure of the respect which that report and her work as ombudsman gained that in 2014, Baroness O'Loan was appointed as chair of the inquiry into the murder of Daniel Morgan and into the subsequent police investigation of that murder. The inquiry's report, published just last year with some difficulty, concluded that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally corrupt in its handling of the case. A crossbench peer since 2009, Baroness O'Loan holds honorary doctorates from the University of Ulster and from the National University of Ireland at Maynooth, a fearless speaker of truth to power, concerned to build a peaceful society on the basis of a just social order. She surely exemplifies for our own time and society the courageous and steadfast virtues of Bartolome de Las Casas. We are immensely honored and grateful that she has agreed to deliver this annual lecture, in which she addresses the road to reconciliation and restoration, a journey of courage and compassion. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming and for joining us virtually on this occasion. Thank you, Father Richard, for your kind words. I'm going to talk initially about conflict on a wider scale, and then I'm going to zoom in somewhat on Northern Ireland today. So I want to start by just reflecting that society is constantly torn by conflict and crime. And today we're exercised about the Ukraine, aren't we? And yet in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, so many other places, there's still war being waged. And other locations are somewhere on the road to recovery from conflict. And that's happening in Northern Ireland. We're still on a road to recovery. We haven't got there. In cities, towns, and villages across the world, there's a lesser scale of conflict, but a conflict which can cause enormous, but very often unidentified trauma to those impacted by what has happened. And in families, parishes, and other small communities, there can be very deep-seated conflict, which may result in the total breakdown of relationships with consequential harm. And the consequences of criminality and conflict across the world are oft reported on, but I think they're equally often unknown and unacknowledged. Yet in so many cases, it's only when the ills that have been done are identified that for some, healing may lead to some form of reconciliation and ultimately to the restoration of a way of living, which is life lived to the full, rather than a life circumscribed by pain and tragedy. Victims are very often the last priority of those in power. They need to manage, to empower, even to appease the perpetrators of conflict in order to bring them to some place where peace is possible. And even where there's a criminal justice process, it may be under-resourced, and many perpetrators of crime therefore go undetected and unpunished. After conflict, and even during its dying days, there will be a need to deal with all the issues affecting both the living and the dead. The living victims and survivors of conflict must find ways to live with their injuries, their trauma, their pain, their search for justice, for proper care, for reparation. For those who survived, but who lost loved ones, the need is often to find out how and why they died, to know who decided that they should die, to know in so many cases whether there was state involvement in the deaths or in the failure to bring those responsible to justice. And there is the terrible question for those from the communities in which paramilitaries or gangs were totally dominant, of whether their loved one dies at the hands of people whom they may have seen as protectors. There may be questions about whether people were sacrificed, whether they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and whether kangaroo courts, such as those presided over by a gentleman called Steak Knife, led to the deaths of innocent people at the hands of organizations such as the IRA, but also other organizations, you know, the UVF, the UDA, ETA, any conflict group, any group that's in conflict across the world has this pattern of behavior. And the infiltration of paramilitary organizations by the state, whether it's the army, the police, or the security service, is well documented in so many countries. Such infiltration is necessary, but it must be conducted according to the highest standards. We saw in Northern Ireland collusion between some members of the security services, police officers, some military personnel, and the various paramilitary organizations. The infiltration of paramilitary organizations by the state, whether the army, the police, security service, is well documented. I give you one simple example. As police ombudsman for Northern Ireland, my ballast investigation into the death of Raymond McCord Jr. and the activities of UVF state agents or informants found that informants engaged in crime were protected from investigation. No matter that they had confessed to murder, they were still allowed to carry on with their criminal activities. Now, I couldn't investigate the informants because they were not police officers. I could only investigate police officers as police ombudsman, but it did result in a police investigation of those paramilitaries. And we did find that in this small area of Belfast, almost all the brigadiers were informants of the state, not knowing that the others were informants of the state. And they were all making an awful lot of money out of this. One UVF brigadier agreed to assist the state as an assisting offender under the legislation, a supergrass. And he agreed to give evidence against his fellow UVF perpetrators. And I actually was asked by the families and the police service of Northern Ireland to monitor that process. So I saw everything that he said. And in the end, he pleaded guilty to over 200 offences, including many murders, attempted murders, arson, intimidation, extortion, and a further 305 offences were taken into account. One member of the UVF linked to 517 serious offences. That gives you some idea of the extent of the criminality which resulted from the activities of the paramilitaries. And it's terrible to think of the generation scarred by murder, by maimings, by beatings, by shootings at the hands of paramilitaries and combatants. And just today I read an account of a young man, father of 4 children, who was asked to present himself for a punishment shooting. And he knew what was going to happen. He packed his bag to go to hospital. And his wife knew what was going to happen. And she stayed at home and he went. And they shot him through the knee, but unfortunately they pierced his artery and he died. So it's not in the past, it's still happening. And conflict inevitably creates many other forms of trauma. Most conflict zones see an increase in the number of victims of abuse, physical, sexual, mental, psychological, spiritual. I think of the mothers and fathers. I worked for a while with the Liberians and Timor-Leste and various other places. The mothers and fathers of the little boys taken to be child soldiers, of the little girls taken to be bushwives. I think of the children of the Northern Ireland Troubles, where men constantly on the run, in hiding for long periods in people's houses, lest the security forces catch them, became predators, abusing the small children where they were hiding, condemning them to silence, because there was nowhere to go with the pain and the woundedness and the bewilderment of what had happened to them. I think, too, of those whose loved ones have suddenly and inexplicably committed suicide, leaving a trail of terrible and unbearable emotions about what should I have done? Why did it happen? Why did I not see it coming? And in all this, there may very often be a terrible anger against the person who has killed themselves because of the damage that has been done to those left behind. And in the midst of all this, there may come terrible guilt that one feels this way, and terrible anger at God, who is omnipotent and who does not intervene to stop horrors such as bombs, bullets, abuse, and suicide. And with that anger comes guilt. And so a person can find themselves quietly over many years racked by anger, guilt, and trauma, and unable to find peace. And we have to acknowledge that anger and guilt and distress come to those too who witnessed the trauma, to the members of the caring professions, the medical officers, the police officers, the clergy, the nursing staff, the paramedics, the social workers, those who are with people in their most terrible moments. Their job is to be with those who suffer, but they bear their burdens as individuals, as human beings. They hurt too. You know, I had responsibility for a large number of police officers studying for master's degrees during the late 80s and 90s, a number of them very senior police officers. But they were operating in a situation in which one day they might have been retrieving the dismembered bodies of bomb victims and studying in a classroom the next day. And sitting here today, that's almost unimaginable, isn't it? That they could have been expected to carry on as they were expected to carry on. And of course, one of the sad things in Northern Ireland was that we developed a kind of black humor, a tolerance which allowed us to live with the awfulness of what was happening every day, which I think wasn't healthy. But if we contemplate the pain of today and the need for reconciliation and restoration, we must always think, I think in our church anyway, of the children for whom childhood was not and is not a comfortable, cozy, safe place. And I'm sure that many of you grew up in a world in which life was predictable and very different from what it is today. But there are those for whom childhood was a time of terror and infinite loneliness, and it seemed there was no one to help, no escape. And there are still children today living on the streets of this great country who live with hunger and fear. I think of one boy I heard about recently. He's 16 years old. When he was very young, from about the age of 8, his first job each morning was to go and collect his mother's heroin. His second job was to help her find a vein in which to inject it. At 16 years old, he's now a homeless heroin addict. Childhood can be very ugly. And our children in Northern Ireland grew up in a society in which sectarianism was and is endemic. And with that goes fear, the inability to walk in certain areas, the inability to go to certain schools, the unavailability of jobs in certain businesses, the inability to socialize in certain places. All that impacts significantly on one's view of life. When a child is abused physically, emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually, that child will be wounded and will carry that woundedness into adult life. Most critically, they will learn not to trust, and they will live with some degree of pain until that pain is in some way healed. Let us think too, just for a minute, about those who put their trust in government, believing that those charged with the delivery of public services will act justly. I think of the haemophiliacs and others who acquired hepatitis C from contaminated blood transfusions. as they gave birth to their children or were treated after accidents. I think of the refusal to acknowledge those failures and of the men and women who fought so desperately to expose the truth. And it's only now that we have the contaminated blood inquiry. I think too of those who have died, lost their homes, gone to prison, had their lives totally changed by the post office's refusal to acknowledge that it was using faulty IT systems for running its post offices. And it accused so many postmasters, innocent postmasters, of theft and fraud. Now, I spent a lot of my time talking to those in pain, the pain of losing a loved one to murder, of suspecting that the police or the army allowed it to happen, caused it to happen, didn't investigate it when it did happen. And I'll never, ever forget the survivors of Omagh to whom Father Richard referred, because I did have to tell them this terrible truth, that there had been a warning that there would be an attack on police in Omagh on the date on which the bomb exploded, the 15th of August, 1998, a lovely sunny afternoon, as the good people of Omagh were going about buying school uniforms and getting the kids ready for school and all that sort of thing. And when it became clear that there had been warning of an attack, they tried to rubbish the warning and the other things which we were able to put together, which indicated that something was going to happen in Omagh on that date. And they said to me that I must not tell this, that it would destroy people, that they wouldn't be able to bear it, that the truth would be too cruel. And that's the fear too, I think, of those who've been abused and who seek in therapy to come to terms with what happened to them. They're often afraid to articulate what happened, lest in the telling of the truth, it should finally destroy them. They do not understand when one tells them, go gently, have courage, the truth will set you free. It does, for it enables them to understand that it wasn't their fault, that they did no wrong, and facing their terrors often does give them freedom, but it is painful. And I think it's truth in all its painful forms, which is one of the great keys to reconciliation and restoration. When I was very young, I first heard the words of the prophet Micah. This is what the Lord asks of you, that you act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. And I think it's that understanding of what I'm created for, which has, I hope, informed all the work I've done. It's not easy to walk with those in pain. Justice, tenderness, and humility demands of each of us that we do so, each of us, that we do so for as long as is necessary, no matter the cost to us as individuals. And we discover then that it is giving that we receive so much more than we could ever give. Faith has such a contribution to make to this work of reconciliation. And, you know, there's a movement that says that faith is private, faith must be private. I don't believe that. And I don't believe we should be afraid to acknowledge our faith. I read once a homily which Oscar Romero gave on the 24th of March, 1980. It's very powerful. Among other things, speaking of the battle for peace in an escalating civil war, he said this: many do not understand, and they think that Christianity should not get involved in such things. But to the contrary, you have just heard Christ's gospel, that one must not love oneself so much as to avoid getting involved in the risks of life, which history demands of us, that those who would avoid the danger will lose their life, while those who out of love for Christ give themselves to the service of others will live, like the grain of wheat that dies, but only apparently. If it did not die, it would remain alone. The harvest comes about because it dies, allows itself to be sacrificed in the earth and destroyed. Only by destroying itself does it produce the harvest. And minutes later, Oscar Romero was shot dead as he celebrated Mass in his cathedral. So it's no glib calling. This gospel of ours is fundamentally and totally demanding. And it requires, as you all know, of each of us, that we see the face of Christ in everybody whom we meet, and that we respond totally to those who need our help, and that we're never too tired or too busy or too embarrassed. It's actually profoundly difficult to be a true Christian. I think of we have 5 sons. I think of one of my boys who, coming to see me once in London, had stopped on his way down in the morning and had a cup of coffee. And he told me that sitting outside on the pavement, drinking his coffee, he saw a homeless man sitting. And so he said to him, "Would you like a cup of coffee? Come and sit with me at the table and have a cup of coffee." So he brought him breakfast, and Damien, they sat together, and the man said to him, "I'm not allowed to sit at these tables." And Damien said, "Yes, of course you are." So he left, he came down and got me, and we were walking back, and the man was still sitting at the table. I've never had the humility or the generosity to ask someone homeless to sit with me at a table. I think that's what we're called to do. I want to reflect for a moment on the language that we use in the context of reconciliation. We talk about forgiveness, healing, and almost in the same breath about reconciliation. And forgiveness is presented as such a simple thing, but it's actually so complicated. And one of the experiences and the problems experienced by those who suffer in conflict is that they often don't know who's done this terrible thing to them, or even worse, they know it, but they cannot admit it. There's a terror that if they name the person, something awful will happen to them at the hands of that organization. I think of a woman who came to me when I was police ombudsman. She came in such terror because she wanted to complain about the fact that the police had not arrested the person she knew had shot her son dead, her young son dead. So I asked her, because I needed to know who had shot her son dead, I said, "Well, who shot him?" And she just went like that. And she froze up and she couldn't speak. And I remember thinking, so I have to find names in this particular area of Northern Ireland of IRA people, because I knew it was IRA. And so I think I got to name number 7, 6 or 7, and she finally nodded as I said the name, and that seemed to open the floodgates. But the terror that possessed her was incredible to see. And people sometimes think that if you don't know who did it, then you have no one to forgive. So how can there be forgiveness? And if they don't repent before you visibly, how can you forgive? I'm absolutely convinced you don't have to know who harmed you, and you don't need their repentance in order to forgive. The processes of trying to deal with injustice are well known, but I think they need in one's head, in dealing with injustice in one's head, but they need to be fully understood by those who seek to provide assistance to others. You know, the different stages: denial, this couldn't have happened to me; the reality, the terrible silence and emptiness; there's sometimes impossible attempts to suppress grief and get on with life as one's called to do; the anger that it happened to somebody I love, or even to me; the desire for punishment or revenge, and the myths that grow up, the rewriting of the story. And people go round and round in these stages, which are also the stages of grief. And just as people think they've finally put it away, it can come back in a terrible way. I was very surprised, you know, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed that Easter Day in 1998. I didn't feel euphoria or happiness or relief. I experienced a terrible, terrible darkness, which was something around, was it for this that so many people suffered and died? And the pain of my own small troubles experience hurtled back into my life with all the attendant problems. So when we walk the path to forgiveness, we may find it's a very rocky and difficult journey. And one of the big things about forgiveness, or the lack of it, is the guilt that it can bring. It can be so destructive. I have heard so many people say that they have been told that they must forgive. It isn't like that. And to place that burden on those who are in such a difficult place is to make their suffering so much worse. It's the product of a lack of understanding of what we're called to, and the fact that the Lord knows that it will take each of us a long time to make our journey towards forgiveness, and it's not easy. It took me some 18 years to get to that place where I worked out that I had not walked in the shoes of the men who took the life of my unborn baby in a bomb explosion, which I was present at. I didn't know them, and it seemed that I would never know them. But then eventually I realized I didn't know what pain they had suffered. I could not know how I might have behaved if I had lived their lives. So in the end, I realized that all I could do was leave them to God. So in trying to forgive, it's important to be careful and to try not to judge. I was thinking about this as I was preparing this for you, And I thought about Gordon Wilson, because forgiveness lies in somewhere in seeing the other not as a murderer, not as a bomber, not as an abuser, but as another human being. And I want to just recount to you the words of Gordon Wilson, who survived the Enniskillen bomb, but whose daughter Marie died during that bombing. And as they lay badly injured in the bombing, they had a little conversation, and it went like this. Gordon says, "She held my hand tightly and gripped me as hard as she could. She said, 'Daddy, I love you very much.' Those were her exact words to me, and those were the last words I ever heard her say. But I bear no ill will, I bear no grudge. Dirty sort of talk is not going to bring her back to life. She was a great wee lassie. She loved her profession. She was a pet. She's dead. She's in heaven, and we shall meet again. I will pray for these men tonight and every night." What courage, what love, what grace that man showed. And the space then of someone's grief is pain, is a holy ground, and we have to tread so sensitively on it. What a person suffers is not the only thing in their life, but they're changed utterly by what happens to them. And for Christians, it's also about accepting that the loved one who has been murdered has also been changed by entering into eternal life with God. I do remember so clearly the feeling of being totally unable to control my future and totally unable to prevent the flashbacks which kept coming to me. When I was teaching in lecture theatres after the bomb, I used to find myself wanting to put my hands up to stop the ceiling coming down on me. The reality is we all know we can't control our future, but we know it from a safe place and from perhaps an understanding of God who loves us and cares for us. When a bomb explodes, a gun is fired, when a critical illness is diagnosed, when we stand and view the body of someone whom we've loved so much, the reality can be too much. I think forgiveness is a grace from God. It involves separating the act from the perpetrator, the sin from the sinner. It involves letting go of anger and bitterness and hatred and seeing the other just as another who's probably in pain too. It's important, I think, to just accept that the road to forgiveness, which is part of healing, can be so long and hard. And finally, I think that one of the most important helpful things to remember is that we're not God. We can sometimes think that we're God in our own lives. But Jesus asked his Father as he hung on the cross, "Forgive them, they do not know what they do." We have to be patient with ourselves, and we have to allow God to do his work of healing within us, because he will. I've heard people talk about the terrible things that happen to them in the consequence of conflict, and in many cases that which happened is buried in the past. But it's still a deep sore, and it's something which prevents peace and happiness because it's unacknowledged and unspoken of. One of the ways in which people survive trauma is by not speaking of it. I think of a person I knew who had sat upstairs in a building doing her homework as a little girl, when suddenly gunmen burst in and killed 6 men, including her father and some of her uncles. As is the way in Northern Ireland, they were buried 2 days later. And they came home, and her mother said, "We will not speak of this again." And they didn't. They never spoke of her father or her uncles again. And the child grew up, yet deep inside her was buried terror and loss and bewilderment and anguish. And 20 years later, as a happily married wife and mother of children, it burst forth at the time of another trauma with such intensity that she became profoundly suicidal. And somewhere in a place of calm and quiet, she found the courage to speak of this unthinkable thing which had happening to her. And in naming it, she began to realize the great evil that had been done to her. And that showed me so strongly how long-lasting are the consequences of evil. And we know too that trauma is transgenerational. The trauma of the last 50 years is visible. So we have to do all we can to ensure that the legacy of the past is dealt with, that healing comes, and that justice is seen to be present. You know, I think of the young people I've met in schools going around Northern Ireland talking, and they sit in these schools and they go to do their work every day as children. They may be going home to care for a relative who has been severely brain damaged by some sort of terrorist incident, who has lost their legs and is unable to take care of themselves. And the pain and the trauma of that person just passes straight down. And so these children, their ability to learn, to be part of the world is inhibited. A lot of work is being done to unite our divided society, and it is, for the most part, forward-looking. But there are those for whom the past is the present. And I think it's our duty to ensure that justice, mercy, and compassion and love form part of our response to the past. So we enable the future and we bring hope to the people. Healing and reconciliation are necessary because of pain, whatever form that pain will take. And pain in societal terms is often caused by the absence of one or both of two critical pillars, truth and justice. And I think there's a fundamental difference between healing and reconciliation. It seems to me that healing is a process which is personal and inward looking. Healing is the balm for the soul. It's the mending of the broken, the fusing of the shattered, the making whole of that which was torn and fractured. I do not believe that societies heal. Societies simply learn to live, I think, with their realities. Societies can be reconciled, but it's the wound and pain of individuals that can be healed. That's part of the work of reconciliation, but only a part. Reconciliation, on the other hand, is a process, I think, which is outward and forward-looking, which brings together elements which belong together, but which have been torn apart. In our church sense, we talk about reconciliation as being the process of acknowledgement of wrongdoing, of repentance, of a commitment to make reparation, and a desire never to be separated again, and of forgiveness. That process can apply to society. It needs trust, and trust is absent where there is conflict. Reconciliation is about not letting the past dictate the future. It's about bringing together the goodness of the disparate parts of a divided community and working on those foundations, rather than allowing the evil of the past to continue to divide us. I don't think there can be reconciliation or restoration of any society until the damage wrought by conflict is remedied by the necessary work of justice. One of the matters I'm currently involved is an investigation into the activities of a man called Steak Knife, who was the person responsible for the discipline unit of the IRA, and responsible, it seems, for many people being sent to their deaths in appalling situations. And we're also investigating loyalists who were part of something called the Glenanne Gang, which was responsible for about 200 murders, we think. Now, 30 prosecution files were submitted to the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland in 2019, relating to 17 murder victims, 12 abduction, unlawful imprisonment victims. Nothing has happened. These matters are part of today. Last week, there was a hearing in the United States Congress about the current government proposals to deal with the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. You know, we've been trying to find a way to deal with our past for decades, but we did have an agreement in 2020, and the British government said in 2020 that they would, within 100 days, publish and introduce legislation to implement what's called the Stormont House Agreement, which was an agreed process for dealing with the Northern Ireland legacies. There would be an oral history archive. Victims and survivors would have access to high quality service. A historical investigation unit would take forward outstanding legacy cases. Inquests would continue. There are people still waiting for inquests 30 and 40 years for deaths which occurred 30, 40 years ago. There would be an independent commission on information retrieval, which would enable victims and survivors to seek and privately receive information about troubles-related deaths, and an implementation and reconciliation group, which would be established by the British and Irish governments, would oversee the work. The British government is now seeking effectively to renege on large elements of its obligations and its promises. It has said that it wants to introduce a statute of limitations to prevent prosecutions for troubles, deaths occurring before 1998. This would mean there would be no further investigation of those deaths. It's also being suggested that instead of investigation, there will be a South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that sort of thing. Now, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is widely lauded as having a wonderful process, and I think it had its strengths. It sat for 7 years from 1996. It bore witness to, it recorded, and in a few cases, it granted amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violations. It offered reparation and rehabilitation to victims. The critical difference with what the government want to do now is that it didn't preclude investigation of deaths. And in fact, there were more than 7,000 applications for amnesty, but only 849 were granted. I visited South Africa and spoke to some of those involved in the commission. There was a very clear view that for all the good it did, not all information was provided by perpetrators. It didn't achieve its aim of bringing about reconciliation, and many of those bereaved and injured were left to carry their burdens alone. It's not a model for Northern Ireland. There are other models. Timor-Leste, there was a Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation. Its mandate was to investigate human rights violations committed between 74 and 99, and that's a very similar period to the period of the Northern Ireland Troubles. Some 200,000 East Timorese died in that period. It was to facilitate recognition, reconciliation and reintegration of minor criminal offenders who submitted confessions. It reported in 2005, but the work of that commission was complemented by investigation and prosecution of the most serious offenders, and 84 people were convicted of the most serious crimes. And there are many other models of Truth Commission which have emerged from conflicts across the world. Each has its deficiency. Very often the outcome of the negotiations to bring war to an end dictate those deficiencies because the needs of combatants rather than the needs of victims are prioritized. What is common to these models and to the original proposals for Northern Ireland is that the existence of a Truth Commission does not preclude investigation of criminality, murder and murders. The rule of law was to be respected. And now, most recently, the government have said that it is their intention to cease all criminal prosecutions for Troubles-related deaths, whether they occurred in Northern Ireland or in Birmingham or Guildford or Warrington, for example. They also intend to remove the right to bring civil actions for damages for the injury suffered. And they also intend to remove the right to the duty to conduct inquests into deaths. All the victims in Northern Ireland, all the political parties, the Northern Ireland, all the political parties in Northern Ireland, the Irish government, the Labour Party, many others are opposed to these proposals. But still the government is saying that a truth recovery process alone would better help the victims. The victims have said it is not so. I chaired the Daniel Morgan panel, as Father Richard told you. We reported in June last year, and we examined the investigation over 34 years of a murder of a young private eye in London in 1987. We looked specifically at evidence of police involvement in the murder, the role played by police corruption in protecting those responsible from the murder for being brought to justice, and the failure to confront that corruption, and the incidence of connections between private investigators, police officers, and journalists at the former News of the World and other parts of the media, and alleged corruption in the linkages between them. Our government seemed to believe that a non-Troubles related murder, wherever it was committed, no matter how long ago it happened, should be investigated. But the murders of the Trouble do not merit the same process. How can that be? If we were to have an independent commission on information retrieval as proposed, it would be necessary for all actors to tell the truth. The agents of the state, those who committed crimes in the names of paramilitary organizations, the police, the military, the intelligence agencies, MI5 particularly, and the intelligence agencies in the south of Ireland. They would all have to tell their story so that there can be an understanding of situations in which paramilitaries were able to continue to operate despite the fact that there was advanced knowledge of plans for murder, despite the fact that on occasion soldiers concealed and carrying out observations witnessed murders taking place and did not intervene, despite the fact that they were armed. so that their presence would not be disclosed. Complex situations, such as the extent to which the IRA operated in Northern Ireland and were under surveillance by An Garda Síochána, the Irish police, who were tracking vehicles used in the commission of crime committed in the north. This would all have to be disclosed. Paramilitary organizations, Republican and loyalists, would have to admit what they did, who planned the operations and why people were killed. Sometimes it was just to generate fear in the local community so that people would know that they must not cooperate to prevent further atrocities. I do not believe this complex truth would be told. So many times while doing this work, I have been challenged. In reporting the truth as established by the evidence available, I and my colleagues have been made aware that we risk undermining confidence in policing and justice. I have even been told that in reporting on matters such as the failing in investigating the Omagh bombing, a bombing which I now firmly believe could have been prevented, I would destroy the peace process. I would destroy my own office of police ombudsman. I would destroy my own reputation. None of that happened. To deny legal process is to deny the rule of law, to deny that everyone, regardless of their position in society, is subject to the law, that the rights of individuals are determined by legal rules and not the arbitrary behavior of authorities, that justice must be seen to be done, that there must, where possible, be openness and transparency, and that the state should comply with all its obligations in respect of human rights. That's what happens when you deny legal process. That is what the government is proposing to do. It is inconceivable to me that government could even contemplate this abandonment of the rule of law in the United Kingdom. Reconciliation and restoration will not be facilitated through the current government proposals. The government too needs to act with courage and compassion. It must not deprive people of their constitutional and legal rights. Wrongdoing in policing, in government, in paramilitarism, in conflict is what destroys the confidence of people in the society in which they live. By learning from the failings of the past, we can prevent future damage. As Mayor Angelou said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. This would be a wonderful legacy for the people of Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for listening to me.